At this time, I'm honored to welcome the members of our distinguished panel. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Bagley, Senior Attorney Litigation, AARP Foundation Litigation; Mark Murphy, Director, PAIMI, Disability Rights New York; Nancy Thaler, Executive Director, the National Association of State Directors of Developmental Disability Services; Kevin Martone, Executive Director, Technical Assistance Collaborative; Mary Beth Musamisi, Associate Director, Kaiser Commission on Medicaid and the Uninsured; and Louis Bossing, Senior Staff Attorney, Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. At this time, we are eager to hear from our distinguished panel. We ask that each panelist make a 3 to 5 minute statement about where we go from here with Olmstead implementation from their distinctive perspective. And let's start with Kelly.
Hello? Oh, there it goes. I'm Kelly Bagby. I work for AARP Foundation. For the last 2 decades, I've litigated Olmstead and Olmstead-esque cases, even before Olmstead. And it's my great pleasure now to work to try to free imprisoned people from nursing homes. So I've been involved in, since I've worked at AARP, 6 different pieces of litigation representing many tens of thousands of plaintiffs who have gotten out of nursing homes and some who we are still fighting to get out. But a big part of, one of the big areas that we really haven't talked about are the folks that are stuck in nursing homes. And there's a reason that they sort of have been late to the Olmstead party, I think. And a lot of it is the same discrimination that people with disabilities have been breaking through for the first, 10 years of Olmstead enforcement. They were really not included. Nursing home residents are, in part because of, quite frankly, ageism. There's a lot of ageism that if somebody's in a nursing home, it's because they need to be in a nursing home. There's this perverse sense that, first of all, that people are getting good care in nursing homes, which I think is a massive exaggeration. But I also think that there's a sense that people go to nursing homes to die, and it's completely unnecessary for people to go to nursing homes to live their last or their best years. And there are many, many young people in nursing homes as well, and I think it's a really untapped part of the advocacy that we need to galvanize around. All of us are, all of us could get old, and all of us hopefully will get old. And all of us could be facing a life in a nursing home, or our loved ones facing a life in a nursing home. So I've been really just so excited to hear all the energy around people wanting to figure out what they could do to do more. And one of the best things you can do to do more is educate people about their own rights, about their own expectations for themselves. And part of what I think is so wonderful is listening to the stories about families who have high expectations. We need to have people in institutions believe that there is a better life for them outside the institution. We believe it, but we need to help them to see it. And a lot of the, I've interviewed many hundreds of nursing home residents, most of whom will tell you they're desperate to get out of a nursing home, but they never thought it could happen. And so what we need to help them see is this is actually a great, there's a great life waiting for you outside this facility. And your expectations need not be so low that, you feel lucky to have a place to be. It's every bit as economically viable for people in nursing homes to live in the community. It's every bit as much their right and choice to be able to choose where they want to live their lives. And so it's incredibly important that we do a lot more outreach and education to folks in nursing homes about what life could look like, and that it's completely realistic and very economically viable for them to leave those facilities as well. I'll leave you with this point. New York has the single highest percentage of nursing home beds in the country. 7.9% of all nursing home beds are in this state. And that's the highest of any state. We need to change that. We need to address that and bring that number down. Do what they call rebalancing. Put a lot more money into community-based services for people who are older and people who are otherwise in nursing homes because they're younger and don't have choices. But there's a lot of work to be done around nursing home residents. So, I don't know who has next.
Each one of you can make a short statement.
Okay, you go next.
Hi, my name is Mark Murphy, and I work at Disability Rights New York as the director of the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness program. I've worked in this area of disability rights for many, many years. Although I'm a recent transfer to New York State. As Kelly mentioned, done a lot of cases over the years, going back a long way, and including back to the days where we were doing individual cases one by one, as was talked about by Tally, including, I'm happy to say, the Helen L. case. And so I've thought about these issues and what's now become known as Olmstead and Olmstead issues for a long time. And I think if we're going to talk about the future of Olmstead, one of the things we have to do is really acknowledge that where we are today, and I think 15 years post-Olmstead, for a lot of people with disabilities, the world still looks like a very segregated and institutionalized place. So while we've made tremendous progress, as has already been said, there's really a long, long way to go. There's still lots of people in developmental centers completely unnecessarily. There's lots of people in psychiatric hospitals who don't need to be in psychiatric hospitals. Kelly talked about nursing facilities, and I always tell people when they talk about parties, it must be very exciting to hear me at parties, but when I talk about my work or something, I'm pointing out just how the shockingly high number of non-elderly people there are in nursing homes. I think most people think nursing homes just have elderly people, and it's simply not true. Way too many children with disabilities are still segregated, particularly kids who have psychiatric illnesses who may end up in residential treatment facilities instead of providing services with the family to keep those families intact. So there's a whole lot, still tremendous amount of work to be done. So for those of you in the audience who are interested in getting into this line of work, don't worry about it. There's going to be plenty for you to do long after everybody who's spoken today has moved on. I think the future is also somewhat less legal than it has been in the past. I think, somewhat necessarily there were a lot of lawsuits. There's still going to be a lot of lawsuits, but I think a lot more advocacy in terms of there's no longer the need to convince as many of these state officials about the wisdom of this. How you do it and getting it done is a separate matter, but everyone is pretty much on board in terms of to do it. And so when you're talking about whether it's Medicaid redesign or state Medicaid agencies or CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, this is where the money comes from. The money drives so much of this. And it's just really important to try and get them to create as much as possible, as many incentives as possible to community living as opposed to institutional living, because now it's better than it was, but there's still lots and lots and lots of money poured into segregated settings. And when the money dries up, the practices that we don't like will stop. Two other quick things. The future is also about real integration outside of the institutional setting, so it's not enough simply to move people into community places and say thank you very much. It requires an ongoing commitment, services, supports, et cetera. I think people have heard about that. And then last thing I would say, particularly for people who are here today and obviously are, because of their presence here, are interested in these issues, I think it's important for you to advocate even in your own lives. I think there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding and fear and stigma around disability. You often hear people say things, particularly in the context of people with psychiatric disabilities. Well, the problem is, deinstitutionalization was a problem, and too many people need to be in hospitals, and it's just not the case. What needs to happen is people need services wherever they are. Geography doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where you are. You don't need to be in a state psychiatric facility to get necessary and appropriate psychiatric services. You don't need to be in a state developmental center. I will take issue with anyone who believes that that there's somehow a need to be institutionalized. And I'll just leave you with one last thing. The single biggest myth that I've encountered in my 30 years of doing this work is that there's some sort of functionality line. And if you're above this functionality line, you can live in the community. And if you're below this functionality line, you can't. And it's not the case. And we have to get away from this idea that people, again, it's not about geography. It's about getting the people the services they need in the quantity they need and the quality they need, not their physical location. That's the least relevant part of it. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Beth Musumeci. I work at the Kaiser Family Foundation's Commission on Medicaid and the Uninsured. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in what has been a really wonderful day. My work focuses on the role of Medicaid for people with disabilities, and as it's relevant to today's discussion, Medicaid plays a key role in supporting the implementation of Olmstead. Before I worked at Kaiser, I also was a lawyer at a state protection and advocacy agency for people with disabilities, where I represented Medicaid beneficiaries who were seeking services. And I also wanted to mention that in addition to the federal law, we also often found that there were state laws, and again, this is going to vary based on where you live, but there are different kinds of strategies and considerations when you think about bringing a case, and we had, at least where I was, a lot of success in getting things resolved more quickly and sometimes less expensively by going to our state Human Relations Commission and making the same kinds of arguments based under state law that people with disabilities had the right to be fully integrated in the community. So that may be another option in some places. My work at Kaiser, as I said, focuses on Medicaid's role, and I think there's a paper that was on the resource table that talks about the key themes based on the 15th anniversary. We took a look back, and particularly in the last 5 years, at some of the themes we saw across the cases and the really great progress that's been done. So as people in this room likely know, Medicaid is the primary funder in this country of long-term services and supports. That includes both institutional and community-based care. As of 2011, Medicaid's funding 40% of all the long-term care in this country. About 3.2 million Medicaid beneficiaries are receiving home and community-based services, with about a total of $52.7 billion in spending nationally. A trend that we've seen and continue to see, and this has certainly been spurred by and supported by Olmstead, is that the distribution between spending on care in the community versus care in institutions has been slowly continuing to increase. So in 2011, 45% of Medicaid spending on long-term care services went to the community. So we're still not quite at the halfway point, but we're seeing the trend continuing to slowly creep up. And lastly, I just wanted to say a few words about kind of the development of the different areas of Olmstead enforcement that we've seen. So, of course, the original kind of round of cases started with people like Lois and Elaine seeking to get out of institutions, and I had the privilege of working with a class of people with developmental disabilities in Delaware who were seeking that same kind of support for community living. But then we've really seen it progress so that Olmstead implementation is entering other arenas, such as the cases, someone mentioned the Rhode Island case, supporting employment in the community in integrated settings rather than in sheltered workshops, in providing services in the most integrated setting appropriate. So for example, in the paper that I mentioned, we profile some beneficiaries, and one is a young man with developmental disabilities from Michigan, who was living in a group home and was very unhappy with kind of the structures and rules of the group home, and through the help of the Medicaid self-direction option, he was able to control his own service budget and hire his own attendants, and now with supports is living in his own apartment, which he prefers and which is less restrictive than this group home, which was also considered a community setting. And then finally, the Medicaid program provides a number of options for states, and this is another area for advocacy to see what your state is doing and what it could be doing to support home and community-based services, some with extra federal funding, as was mentioned earlier. And another interesting option, I think, is a program called 1915I, which actually allows Medicaid funding for home and community-based services sort of as preventive care. So the typical test to get home and community-based services in Medicaid is that you have to otherwise require institutionalization. And the interesting thing about this relatively new option is that you still have to meet certain functional criteria that the state sets, but it's something less than what you would need to qualify for institutional care in your state. And so the idea is, let's get people services earlier, let's support them before, so we can prevent them from their needs deteriorating. So I think that is something that holds a lot of promise. The other things that we're thinking about and working on, of course, are the new home and community-based setting rule, which was discussed earlier, that really tries to define what does it mean to live in a community-based setting. And then finally, there's a movement in many states, including New York, to provide Medicaid services through managed care, including the home and community-based services and the long-term care services. And so what does that look like when that population is transitions into managed care? There are a number of issues to come up that I think are important to watch.
Yeah, want me to go, Nancy, or do you want to go? Okay. Hi, everyone. Kevin Martone from the Technical Assistance Collaborative in Boston. We're a nonprofit consulting firm, and we spend almost all of our work really working across states on community integration issues. And so we're touching many of the states right now that have active litigation or settlement agreements, or we're working proactively with states who are really trying to implement Olmstead going forward. In a prior life, I was the mental health commissioner just across the river in New Jersey. And at the time in 2005 was hired by the governor with the mission of fix the system and settle this Olmstead litigation that was just filed by the Protection Advocacy Group and my colleagues at the Bazelon Center. And so I have had the opportunity to really grapple with that at a state level, and then also really get to see it nationally. You know, I think there's 4 points that I'd really want to hit in terms of starting to think through or think forward on this issue. This is a marathon, okay? You know, I think we'd all like it to be a 100-meter sprint where we see the results more quickly, but the reality is it's a marathon. And I think that shapes a lot of, you know, all of our advocacy efforts. You know, bureaucracy, government in and of itself, does not inherently transform itself. It really needs that pressure to do that. It needs pressure from stakeholders like yourselves, family members, providers, consumers and service recipients yourselves, as well as sometimes, frankly, litigation to really push those things along. You know, and this is a really, really complex issue to try to grapple with in states. I remember very vividly having conversations over a 2-day span, one day with a bunch of self-advocates who had come in to say, we were about 2 years into our transformation, who had come in to say, listen, you guys are doing nice work. You're really moving people into supportive housing settings. Your state hospital census is coming down, but you're not going fast enough. The very next day, I had a conversation with the statewide provider association, and they came in and said, we really respect what you're trying to do. We know you have a lot of pressure against you. You're going too fast. And inherently, that's the part of the struggle that you deal with when you're in bureaucracy. You know, and then you think about, frankly, you know, when it comes down to it, really trying to make some of these changes in a political context. You know, when you're looking at trying to support community integration and people in integrated settings, and frankly, at times you're trying to downsize, you know, your numbers of people who are in state hospitals or nursing facilities or developmental centers, there are a lot of people who are going to support you, and there are a lot of people who are going to come out against you. And, you know, that can be really, really hard conversations. I used to joke around with my wife, and I said, if I don't come home tonight, I'm probably buried under Giant Stadium next to Jimmy Hoffa. But I'm not sure who took me out, because it might have been the hospital association, it might have been the providers, those conversations are really hard, you know. And a lot of times, somebody had alluded to it earlier. Frankly, when it comes to downsizing, you know, institutions, organized labor and unions are a real challenge, and you have to sort that out in states. It's just the reality. Leadership in states is a big issue. I think to the extent possible, there are a lot of folks in state government who would call themselves advocrats. You know, folks who are really championing the mission, and you really want to tap into those folks. But the reality is, when you look at a state agency like, you know, here in New York or another state, the state mental health commissioner or the state developmental disabilities commissioner or the state Medicaid director turn over every 2 years. So how do you sustain systems transformation going forward? It's really hard to accomplish that in states. But at the same time, you have to really make sure that those expectations and that bar is set high, because otherwise you don't get there. Another piece I think that's really important is just education in general. You know, we talked a little bit about, I mean, if you talk to anybody in this room or anybody in the field about whether they support community integration and serving people in community settings, you're going to get general consensus. It's when you start to peel that onion about what it means. You know, and frankly, we've heard some of that today too, in terms of some of that policy debate is still out there in states. And so there's a lot of education that really has to occur. There's still a lot of provider education. You know, so that, you know, you can go out and talk to a community-based provider right now, and they will say, you know, yeah, I want people to live in integrated settings, but, you know, there should be no yeah, but in the conversation. And I think that there's a lot of education that has to happen there. There's a tremendous amount of education that has to happen with elected officials, state staff. You know, I teach a course at Tufts School of Medicine to 3rd and 4th year medical students. Usually only one or two is going into psychiatry, about community integration and things like that, because as frontline practitioners, they deal with this stuff on a regular basis, and they need to know really what integration means out there. A couple of quick points. I think we have to think forward, right? So we've talked about integration from institutional settings. We grapple with what I call community institutionalization or trans-institutionalization. People who are living in nursing facilities or adult care homes in New York or residential care facilities in another state. They're just called different things in different states. But there's this community institutionalization. It's very pervasive. In every state in the country right now, I would bet that there's an Olmstead case waiting to happen because people are stuck in these settings. To moving it towards integrated living arrangements, to moving it towards employment. I was so happy to hear the Deputy Secretary start off the conversation today about employment, because we're starting to get a handle on what community living is. We really haven't gotten a handle on what that means for employment going forward. And then we need to think beyond that, you know, for the next, you know, what does it look like in 25 years? I also think we need to think early. We need to design our systems and services earlier for people so that we can try to minimize the Olmstead threat down the road. You know, outcomes, if we wait too long, are not good. But when we intervene early in early childhood and other types of community-based interventions early, we are trying to ensure that people don't become part of the system, but can really move into mainstream systems going forward. And I think we also have to think about what are we trying to accomplish, right? So, you know, when you think about what the Affordable Care Act offers and what Olmstead offers as a platform for community integration, think about Affordable Care Act right now. It's essentially guaranteed insurance for folks, all right? If we're going to think about affordable housing for folks, a lot of times we're talking about rental assistance, and it's very much a needed issue, especially in, you know, cities like New York where the cost of housing is exorbitant. But anywhere in the country you go, anywhere in the country, I don't care if it's rural Iowa, your SSI check is not going to cover your rent living out there. So if we're going to really talk about this, we also have to start to talk about how are we going to address poverty for folks and getting people employment so that we can have people be able to afford housing better, or at the very least, even if people need rental assistance, it's a decreased amount of rental assistance, which is spreading those federal housing dollars even further going forward. So we also really have to talk about how we can really address some of the poverty issues for folks, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Working? Not working? Is it working? You just keep talking. It works. Okay. Hi. It's great to be here. I first want to say what a privilege it is, and how appreciative I am to be in a group of people that are committing their lives to social justice. That is not a popular and status role these days in our country. People use the word social justice the way they use communism, as though somehow you are subversive, when really you are bringing the Constitution to life, honoring everyone's citizenship. So thank you for doing that, and there's no doubt that it's needed. The question about community versus institution has been answered in a lot of places. We have 13 states that have no institutions for people with significant disabilities, and many, many states that are down to 50 and 60. And so that book's been written. We do know how to do this. There's not a question. But this panel is a little bit about the future, and here's our challenge. It's prejudice against people who have significant disabilities and who look most different from the typical person. So, testing, societally and in our service systems, we're okay with people who use wheelchairs and people who have visual impairments or blind or deaf or who can spar with everybody. We get that. Like full inclusion in school, we know how to do that. But there is a prejudice that people who look different or talk different, who can't control their behaviors completely, don't belong. And no one will say that out loud, but it is clearly present in general thinking. There must always be somebody who needs the institution, so therefore we still speak in those terms. Okay. I remember when who like to think I'm progressive and committed, I remember when I didn't think people could work. And it wasn't until a young gal who worked in my agency took me out in a company where people with significant disabilities were working, where I had my head reordered. And I realized there was a different vision. So from that experience, I'm going to say I don't blame anybody for having prejudice, and we know what we know. But we have to keep alive the assumption and the belief, and now the evidence, that everybody can be in the community. This is for everybody. So those of you looking to the future to champion social justice, it is, I would ask you to be transformed yourself if you have that prejudice, and then fight for those people who have the most significant disabilities, because that's where our battle is. There's a lawyer in Philadelphia whose name is Steve Gold, and I was so glad to hear reference to the Helen L. case, which was the first case. Steve Gold is the attorney who litigated the Helen L. case. He still is in Philadelphia. You can get on the Steve Gold listserv, and he's still out there agitating, right? It's a good listserv. But I once saw Steve speak to a group of self-advocates, which is the term people with intellectual disabilities use. And he said to them, I will represent you, but not until you take social action. When you make your efforts and you try to change the injustice and you have difficulty or you fail, I will come to your side and work for you. But you first have to make the effort. And I walked away with that, realizing that that was the ultimate respect. He was saying, you can change the world. I'm here to help you change it, not do it for you. And he's a real ally and a real partner in making people feel their own power, exercise their own power, and he becomes their instrument. And so sometime I hope you get to invite Steve and talk to him about what he's done over the years. But thank you.
Hi, thank you everybody. Thanks for having us today. It really is a privilege to be in a room with so many fierce advocates, including all of the fierce advocates who've been on stage today. My name is Louis Bossing. I work for the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. As the person who's speaking last, I have to say that some of what I would want to say has already been said, but I can emphasize and reiterate. I've worked at the Bazelon Center, which is based in Washington, D.C., working nationwide to advance the rights of people with mental disabilities. I've worked there for about 7 years. It's been a really exciting time to be there because not only, as we often have in the past, worked with advocates all over the country, worked with private attorneys, often working pro bono to assist us in our efforts, but I've been at the Bazelon Center while the Department of Justice has been doing such great work in terms of ensuring the rights of people with disabilities to live in their own homes and communities. So it's been a really exciting time. My colleague, formerly at the Justice Department and now at the Bazelon Center, Allison Barkoff, as she said this morning, or she kind of alluded to kind of the first generation of Olmstead cases, which were all about deinstitutionalization, permitting folks to transition out of state facilities, state psychiatric facilities, and state developmental centers into the community. I've had the opportunity at Bazelon to work on some of the trans-institutionalization cases that Kevin Martone was referring to, in which the institutions are privately owned and operated. It's still a state system, but they're private institutions like nursing homes, including a case in Connecticut that Kevin and I will be working on in different capacities in the very near future. But much of my time at the Bazelon Center has been spent on our education cases, and so I have to echo something else that Kevin said. At the Bazelon Center, we think that, you know, if the state institution legal actions were the first generation, and the trans-institutionalization cases were the Olmstead 2.0, then the Olmstead 3.0 certainly should include education and the opportunities that our public education systems give us to provide early intervention and to ensure that students are able to be educated in the most integrated settings appropriate. You know, the Olmstead mandate, the integration mandate, applies to everything that government agencies do, and they apply to all state and local government agencies, including public education agencies like school districts and public institutions of higher education like John Jay and CUNY. We at the Bazelon Center, we've worked a lot on issues or the rights of students with what I'll call behavioral disabilities, students whose behaviors may interfere with their learning or with the learning of others. And, you know, we believe that virtually all students with behavior support needs can be served in their neighborhood schools, in general education settings, with the appropriate kinds of supports and services and specialized instruction. You know, many schools have figured out how to do this, but too often we see, at least in some of the jurisdictions in which we've worked, that students with behavior support needs are pushed out in one way or another. They're pushed out into separate classes or separate schools where they're only with other students with disabilities, and they're probably receiving, in many of those separate schools, inferior instruction. They're not getting the same kind of quality of education as other students are getting. Or they're pushed out because they get in trouble and they end up suspended or expelled or involved with juvenile justice. Either way, we know that for those students who are pushed out, what happens to them later in life, their outcomes are, they're at a real disadvantage. They're far more likely to fall behind in school, to drop out, to become criminal justice or juvenile justice involved, to have great difficulty finding and sustaining employment. So I totally want to echo that making sure that students receive the supports they need to be served in the most integrated setting appropriate which most of the time is going to be in regular classrooms with everyone else, definitely a part of Olmstead, definitely something we're looking at. We provided today a complaint that the Bazelon Center filed with co-counsel in June of this year up in Springfield, Massachusetts, alleging that that school district assigns hundreds of students with behavioral disabilities to a separate public day school that is inferior to the district's neighborhood schools. And as that case proceeds to trial, we will show that students at the separate school don't have the same opportunities to learn and graduate as other students do, and that they're not being educated in the most integrated setting appropriate, because with appropriate supports, they could be in their neighborhood schools. So we think that education education advocacy of that sort, not only legal action, is an important part of the future of Olmstead. I also have to echo what everyone has been talking about today, because it's a big concern of ours at the Bazelon Center. And I have to admit that I have not worked a lot on our employment advocacy at Bazelon, but before I was at Bazelon, I was at the Employment Law Center in San Francisco, where I worked with dozens or maybe hundreds of workers or job applicants with disabilities who were trying to get the supports they needed in order to do their jobs. And certainly, I would agree with everyone that employment advocacy is part of the future of Olmstead. And I can tell you from our perspective, working with folks with serious mental illness, we've talked about how segregation functions in different settings. And for folks with serious mental illness who are receiving state-funded supports, those supports are often delivered kind of through rehabilitative services that are provided in segregated settings, facilities where you go during the day. You're supposed to be getting, skills training, social and recreational activities, structured social activities. These kinds of day treatment programs are supposed to help people build life skills and live independently, but people in day treatment often just hang out with other people with serious mental illness, playing games, doing arts and crafts, even where there is a nominal effort or a regulated effort to make these kinds of services employment focused. They're not really, I don't think the outcomes demonstrate that they're really helping people build the skills they need to live independently and to work in integrated settings. We're very concerned that people with serious mental illness are not getting the opportunities to get services like supported employment services, which help them get real jobs in settings just like the settings in which all of us are working and learning at competitive wages. Supported employment services that would include help getting the job, help keeping the job through job coaching, through coaching on interpersonal skills and other kinds of skill building. This is how we feel states should be providing services to people with serious mental illness in the most integrated setting appropriate, by giving them the opportunity to work in actual jobs in the same workplaces as everybody else works, working with non-disabled fellow workers, rather than in segregated day treatment programs. I mean, I'd say that that's the vision of Olmstead. That's where Olmstead is taking us, so that people with disabilities get to make the same choices about working and learning and living in the same schools and workplaces and homes and communities that everybody else gets to make. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you to all our panelists. At this time, I'm honored to invite my colleagues from the CUNY Coalition for Students with Disabilities to engage our panel with questions. I'm pleased to introduce Anna Riefman of LaGuardia Community College, Louise Guiderez of Hunter College, and Stacey Ann D'Souza of Brooklyn College. And I'm pleased to open the dialogue with our first question. In doing some research on the promise of Olmstead in New York State, Harvey Rosenthal, Executive Director of the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services, has suggested that New York State could establish the national standard for disability policy and deinstitutionalization. Please help us to envision what such a national model would look like and what would be its key elements, and I open this to the entire panel for discussion.
I can start, I guess. And so I know I followed New York stuff from afar to some degree, and I know there was a lot of discussion about downsizing and closing some of the larger state psychiatric hospitals. And I think if you were to think about the vision for the system, broadly speaking, you know, it is going to be fewer people served in state psychiatric hospitals. I think, frankly, the number of state psychiatric hospitals in the state should be decreased. It doesn't mean that at some point someone with a psychiatric disability doesn't need or require access to inpatient care, but that does not necessarily need to be at state hospital level of care. It should really be geared towards treating that person's acute episode and really, you know, with the foresight of having them return right back into the community as quickly as they can. It's really setting up that continuum of community-based services that can really support people, you know, in integrated settings, people's, you know, housing of choice that they can afford, really helping them think through how they can, you know, go back and pursue employment or post-secondary education and things like that. But it's making sure that you have those right types of supports, you know, in those settings, but also, you know, the right types of safety net services that can really intervene when needed, and ideally treat people or serve people if they are having some kind of acute care crisis episode where they're at, in their place of living, in their community, to really try to divert that hospitalization. Many times, if the services are there and they're flexible and responsive, that can occur. That crisis situation can be mitigated or resolved so that people's lives don't have to be disrupted and they have to go into institutional-like settings.
The other, I think that's right. It would sort of an ideal plan would cover sort of all the things we've talked about, from employment, education, et cetera. It would also include something we haven't really, I don't think, talked about much today, is certainly on the mental health side, and that is a far more robust set of, which no one heard me say, okay, diversion type services, particularly to divert people out of prisons and jails. Those of us in the room who live in New York, and maybe others, are familiar with a lot of the publicity that's been going on around Rikers Island, and about 40% of the people at Rikers Island, which is has about 12,000 people, so 40%, somebody can help me with that, but it's a lot of people, have some form of a mental health diagnosis, and about 800 to 1,000 have a significant mental health diagnosis. And there are many people at Rikers, for example, who had, if there was a better kind of diversion program, wouldn't necessarily end up there. If we had community programs for people who they get in trouble with the law, maybe end up getting mental health services. You know, Rikers is really the embodiment of that expression. You know, if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. You know, and so somebody gets arrested. In fact, the two cases that have gotten the most publicity about the two men who died in the last year under very, very terrible circumstances at Rikers, both of them were in jail for incredibly low-level stuff. One got busted for a parole violation because he hadn't done a change of address form, and he ended up back in jail. Another was picked up for essentially vagrancy. He was homeless. You know, they gave him a bond that he couldn't make, of course, and ended up in jail. So, I mean, these are folks who had mental health issues. There are many more people like this. Now, again, if we had some kind of diversion programs or the full array of these types of programs where people would get mental health services on the front end instead of ending up in jail. But again, the problem isn't that we don't have hospitals where they could go. The problem is that we don't have the community services in place where we need them to be. So it's your question has a wide range of answers, but it includes a lot of the elements that we've just talked about.
All right. I'd like in turn to give the floor to Anna to ask our next question if nobody else wants to.
Hello. This question is primarily for Kelly, but I invite the other panelists to weigh in. I'm proud to say that I'm part of the growing population of older New Yorkers who are making important contributions to our community. There are 3.7 million New Yorkers over the age of 60. As New York State becomes decidedly older, how can Olmstead help us to prepare that we continue to live vibrant lives integrated in our communities?
That's a great question. So New York is not alone in this. The population as a country is growing very, very quickly at a staggering rate. The number of people who are going to be over 65 is going to grow exponentially in the next 10 years. And there aren't enough young people to support them if we're going to keep putting loads of money into institutionalizing them. So we really do, from an economic perspective, we absolutely have to rethink how we're doing things. But from a civil rights perspective, we also have to rethink the way we're doing things. If we continue to not, as Mark was saying, if we continue to not put services in a place where people are getting appropriate health care at an early stage, so their diabetes doesn't get uncontrolled, their heart disease doesn't get uncontrolled, they're being connected to physicians in a meaningful way so that their health conditions remain stable. And I think the ACA is a big benefit for that, because the group from 50 to 64 was a group that was, when they hit Medicare, they were sicker than anybody ever expected them to be, because many of them were uninsured. So now under the ACA, many more people 50 to 64 are able to get health insurance, which allows them to not, be so expensive when they hit the need for long-term care or for Medicare. So I do think some of the things are in place. It's very early, and I think a lot of it is education, so that, all of you all who have family members who are neglecting their health, and all of us who are neglecting our health, all of us who are eating poorly, these are all things we can control. There's a lot of this is self-controlled behavior, but a lot of it is really connecting people to better health choices and pushing our lawmakers to put money where diversion will help, instead of letting all the money go to, as one of the questioners said, there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes into keeping an institution going. If you continue to put money into an institution, when you build it, they will come. They will fill that institution. Whereas if you downsize institutional care, you don't have to close it completely. If you downsize your dependence on institutional care, there's going to be more money to put into community care, and that will help to keep from having this deep end problem, which we are seeing now.
Working? Yes. I'd like to respond to that too. So this is a phenomenon that's happening in the United States and all of Western Europe and Japan, where there's a growing aging population and acquiring disabilities as we age. And countries are responding to it differently. Japan is investing in robotics because they have the most serious problem. They don't believe in immigration, so they know they're not going to change the population shift. Germany is incentivizing construction companies to build multi-generational housing. You can look at parts of the United States, Hartford County, Maryland, some cities, some counties that are, as governments, getting together to figure out how to make the communities aging friendly. Regarding transportation, you have in Boston Beacon Hill, a self-organized community of people who created a little nonprofit to support them in their own homes. So lots of people are thinking about how to make the community, the physical community, much easier for people to live in. We're not doing that as a national agenda at all. Other countries are. But government absolutely cannot do it all. The financial resources aren't there. And the truth is that the real long-term care system in this country is actually families. If for the older population, 85% of the caregiving are spouses and children. In developmental disabilities, 90% of the people live with their families. And so I think one of the solutions is to recognize that families do long-term care. They're the system. And that what government can do is support and enhance them to make it easy, to make it fun, so everybody can have good outcomes. But partnering and supporting families, I think, is a big solution.
Thank you. Now I'd like to give the floor to Luis for our next question.
My question is, what are the keys to ensuring the sufficient community resources and supports are in place to provide effective transitions for consumers from institutional settings into the community, especially those with psychiatric and intellectual disabilities?
So part of it, I think, community mental health. I came out of college and I first started working with individuals. I sort of learned from my colleagues that it was helping a person admit that they had a mental illness, they should take their medication, and everything we did was trying to keep them out of the hospital. And when I look back on that, that was all wrong, right? It's, when you think about what we're doing today, it's really helping people develop and maintain those independent living skills so that they can succeed in community-based settings. And so that means thinking differently about how we work with individuals. You know, it even means through the Medicaid program, developing services that are designed to help people maintain their housing, you know, how to pay their bills, how to maintain their housing units and things like that. You know, for folks who are coming out of institutional settings, you know, that work has to be going on in that institutional setting as well, prior to that person going out. It shouldn't just be prescribing them medications in the institutional setting. So that's where our thinking has to be, I think, you know, in this area. I'll leave it at that. I want to give some folks some other chance.
Two things real quick. Throw that out somewhere. The core holding of Olmstead was that the unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities is illegal discrimination. And I think that we have to come up with a you know, societal and political will to put that into place. The same way as a society, we no longer tolerate, it still happens, but we no longer really tolerate overt acts of racial discrimination, gender discrimination. There's all sorts of discrimination that we try to stamp out. It doesn't, it still occurs, of course, but I don't think anyone would argue that people allow it to happen. No one would say it's okay if it happens. And I think we haven't gotten to that place yet with disability discrimination, except of the most overt kind, and with some forms of job discrimination and a few other things. Secondly, I think the way to ensure or get closer to the goal of more funding for the community settings is to be smarter about this. We're spending lots and lots and lots, and I could go on with several more amounts of money, but we're not spending it, in my view, in the right places or in the right way. So it may require more money, there's no question about it, but we're wasting, we're spending, this money's being spent already. When people say, well, we don't have the money for this, we can't afford to do this, most of the money is being spent already. If you don't provide appropriate services and so on, they end up in jails and emergency rooms at higher costs, for example, particularly true in the psychiatric disability system. So it's not as if we're not spending the money already. We just have to spend it more smartly and in a more targeted way.
All right, thank you. I'd like to give the floor to Stacey Ann for our final question.
Being a member of CCSD has shown me the power of people with disabilities lifting other people with disabilities, lifting up other people with disabilities. From the panel's perspective, what can we as college students, proud members of the disabilities community, do to ensure the meaningful implementation of the Olmstead?
Can I take the first stab at this? I think you all are already doing it. I mean, God bless you. You've done so much just doing that film and the education you've gotten yourself. I mean, you all are way ahead of the curve, and you are the leaders now. So you're going to have to just keep doing what you're doing. I mean, and trust your instincts. The idea that you all have such a deep understanding of what Olmstead means, which takes most lawyers, it takes them, a decade to get it. And you have a very deep internal understanding that comes through in everything you all say and in the film and in this whole day. But, I think that you all just need to keep talking amongst yourselves as well. And you should talk to people you term to be experts, but you're experts yourselves. And I think a lot of what you have to do is broaden the scope of the people you speak with. Broaden the scope of the people with disabilities that you speak with. So you're not just hearing your own voices amongst yourselves. Go find other people with disabilities and talk with them too. Because this has been the single greatest education in my 2 decades of representing people with disabilities, is talking to my clients and hearing what it is their needs are and hearing what it is, because there is no answer. There's no one answer. Everybody is different, and building a system that has the flexibility, which you all already understand, the flexibility to meet the individual needs and to really truly listen to people, that's the answer. That's what you all are doing, and you just got to keep doing it.
Thank you all so much for this wonderful panel. Now we're going to take one question from each side of the audience, and then we're going to wrap up. Back there?
Yeah, I was cut before, so I say I'm just going to push myself in. First, I want, since this is talking about the future, I want to make a statement, and I don't know if any of you are aware of the discrimination that is going on for those parents who have kept their children at home all these years. Now, we are all for integration. We want those institutions to be closed, and they should have been closed years ago. I mean, we shouldn't be 15 years after the fact first addressing Olmstead. That being said, in New York State, if you feel that your child needs some supportive residential facility, they're over 21, their brothers and sisters have left home, they want to leave home, maybe they need 24/7 services, okay? They will not get those services. The people who will get the services are the people who are coming out of the institutions, which we all agree with, and then other people who have had the foresight to put their children in residential schools. They've had a battle with their CSCs. Some of the CSCs don't want to battle. They go along with it. Comes 21, the education system is not going to pay for it, and the state will service them quite well, from what I've heard. This is a form, I think, of discrimination. And as much as you say 90% of people with developmental disabilities live with their families are not going to live forever, you know, and you can't inflict on a sibling, you're going to take care of your brother or sister. They have their own lives. So this going forth, there was a rally in May made up of people throughout New York State that really said, you have to stop this. It's one thing, yes, to support your families at home, but there comes a time when the person needs to leave the home, wants to leave the home. And this is something that we might just have to have a class action suit on. Any of you lawyers who are interested, we will, there's Grow. Okay, but that's one statement. The other thing I have is a question. My understanding when we applied for the Medicaid waiver, which is still not being granted yet, every year it's supposed to be this year, there was supposed to be an independent advocate for managed care. And and I was on that committee that made this recommendation. And apparently the federal government required that. Every time I bring that up, I get, we're working on it. So I pose those two statements and then a question. Anybody know anything about the independent advocate? No. Okay, then I'll ask the other thing. Yeah.
On your first point, I think you're absolutely right. And in most states, there's been this terrible in the situation you describe where people have remained at home. I remember we were on Olmstead. And we included a provision that for every person who came out of the state center, one person had to come off the waiting list. And I, somewhat immodestly, thought that was a pretty good model, as did she, but it doesn't seem to have caught on, like so many of my ideas, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, but it was, I thought it was a good idea at the time, obviously, because it got somewhat to this problem, and it was limited by numbers, because obviously there were only so many people in the DD center, as that particular case was. But this is all part of what I think has to happen as part of moving forward with this whole Olmstead issues, that there has to be address issues on the waiting list, whether you include people in the situation you're in or however they're on the waiting list, because you're going to need the service. But you've identified a very, very important issue.
Two things I think are important here. One is alignment of policy. And we see this in states that have active Olmstead litigation, is that the state then focuses all of its efforts on trying to settle that litigation and investing the resources there. And arguably, sometimes resources are moved over to support that. You know, we see that, a lot of times we see that when it comes to homelessness policy and disability integration policy. And I think one of the things that we try to say to folks, and I think it's applicable to folks who are living at home with families, is to try to align that policy to the extent possible. Because, you know, certainly at some point for families, you know, what I've seen, this was my experience in New Jersey, was, all right, the family member dies and the person goes into the institution, and then they come back out. And so I think to some degree it's an alignment of policy. I think the second part of that is, you know, making really good arguments to elected officials and state treasury, for instance. When you're closing an institution, I mean, I know in New Jersey, when I was working on a state psychiatric hospital side, it cost over $300,000 a year per person per facility. We had hundreds of millions of dollars into those places. When facilities close, those dollars have to be redirected. And when they're redirected, they probably should balance folks who are at risk of institutionalization. And sometimes that category can be broadened.
However, so in the 51 states, meaning including the District of Columbia, the most success has come when families simply organize politically and lobby. Pennsylvania has an organization called the Waiting List Campaign, and they got a very conservative governor who didn't give anybody a dime, who took $1 billion out of the education system. They got him to give them several $1 million for the waiting list campaign. I think the argument is so human and so compelling that if you stay at it, you will win legislators and governors over. litigation for the waiting list is a little risky unless your state has entitlement legislation, and I think has even backfired in one or two cases. But that sort of compelling argument about human need that's consistently communicated and people use their local legislators, I think has been very successful in many states. And good luck.
We have one. I got you covered. The last question of the day. Let's wrap. Go ahead.
Doesn't seem, oh, there we go. Thank you. I'll be brief. I have a legal question with regard to employment. I work for JP Morgan Chase. I do not speak for that corporation, but I notice that we are scared to death of customized employment. Reasonable accommodation will do 24/7, but customizing, so how can we create a safe harbor for corporations like JPMC to provide customized employment without opening the doors to, well, then you have to customize. I want my job customized. Who doesn't want their job customized? Thank you.
Who's tackling that one?
Well, let me just say that one way to look at it, and I don't doubt that J.P. Morgan Chase has much more high-priced lawyers than I am, but it depends on how you view it. I'm not sure that, I mean, you're calling it customized work. I might call it reallocating certain job functions, so and that's can be a reasonable accommodation. So I think it could be how you view it, and I realize the concern. On the other hand, if you're doing it to affirmatively ensure employment for people with disabilities, and you are having them do real work at competitive pay, again, I'm not sure what the concerns are specifically, but I think if you spin it not as customized job, but as providing accommodations for people who need them, you might be able to do something with that. But it's the last question of the day was in some ways the most complex. So,
all right, well, with that, let us as a group, thank the students and thank this panel.